Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion. Let's take a look at a video.
Every single inch of the Bible condones slavery.
All right. We could, of course, measure this walking library, the Westminster Study Bible from Westminster John Knox, my beat-up and busted Hebrew Bible, 7 1/4, and a 28 with, decoration, classic UBS 4.
You know, I don't know if it's that simple. Hey, my name is Dane Alexander Smith. I'm a scholar of the Bible and interpretive theories. Now, I've watched a whole bunch of videos from Dr. Dan McClellan, and he and I actually agree a whole bunch of times. I really appreciate his scholarship. However, the way that he talks about the Bible and enslavement, I think lacks some of the nuance critical scholarship often brings to these kind of discussions.
The Bible absolutely indisputably condones slavery.
The Bible quite openly and explicitly endorses slavery.
You see, arguing the Bible endorses slavery or condones slavery, I just think can't be sustained whenever you're aware of the ancient context of slavery and aware of the way that oppression affects the way that we should read those ancient texts. There are actually many different biblical texts and contexts that complicate the interpretation of the Bible on the topic of enslavement. This is why Dr. Emerson Powery writes, in Ancient Slavery and its New Testament contexts, readers of the Bible should develop critical awareness about the use of the Bible. And when interpreters have a critical awareness about the use of the Bible in discussions on enslavement, they realize that the arguments the Bible condones slavery or endorses slavery is just too simplistic. You see, every inch of the Bible does not condone slavery. Rather, people's interpretations of the Bible condone slavery. And that may seem like I'm splitting hairs, but it's actually really important. This is about interpretation and hermeneutics. And I think Dr. Dan McClellan actually would agree with this.
And there's a huge problem with this. And the problem is that the Bible doesn't say anything at all. It's a text. It cannot speak, and it does not have inherent meaning. Meaning only exists to the degree that it is created in the mind of a reader, a listener, or a viewer.
Understanding this basic hermeneutic fact that readers are the ones who construct meaning in a text is incredibly important, because subjective human interpreters must decide what's significant in a biblical text. We have to discern a text's intention, what contexts matter to that text. If a text is even relevant to be read, we have to decide whose interpretations make the most sense. And every interpreter brings their own subjective experiences to a text when they read it, and their concerns guide how they read that text. That being said, when we talk about the Bible like it condones things, we ignore that interpreters are the ones making those interpretive choices. And we present the Bible like it's some authority making statements and declarations on its own, when in reality, there's a real human interpreter bringing meaning to those words. Oh, if only I knew how to read, then this would make so much more sense.
We need to learn to think critically about how everything we're bringing to the Bible influences how we read it. And we need to develop the discipline to overcome the impulse to appeal to its authority, to baptize our own intuitions and our own dogmas.
So I want to invite all of us to think and talk more critically about the way that we talk about texts of slavery and enslavement, freedom and liberation. And when we acknowledge that humans are intimately involved in making the Bible mean something, it pushes us all to have more interpretive humility and recognize that the topic of slavery and enslavement, freedom and liberation, all of those topics are a whole lot more complex in biblical texts. And in all that complexity, you realize the Bible does not have one position on slavery. Rather, the Bible represents many different perspectives. And so what do we do when we interpret biblical texts and we find that they have different perspectives on slavery and enslavement, freedom and liberation? Well, we could of course be like the abolitionists and be like, God is on the side of the oppressed and God's on the side of liberation. And let's look through the Bible and find all the places that it talks about liberation, where rights and the the oppressors are wrong. We could argue that. Or we could be like the enslavers of the past and just use the Bible in a domineering way to oppress people and say, the Bible's on the side of slavery and the Bible's on the side of oppression through God's divine ordering. But the problem with either of these options is you just get into an argument about whose interpretation is better, which texts are more important and more valuable, which better represents the heart of Scripture or something like that. Moreover, the impulse to argue that the Bible has one universal position over a topic is actually a result of imperialist and colonialist logic. And it does not accurately represent the complexity of the many texts we find in Scripture. Dr. Edward Said, in his book Culture and Imperialism, says this about imperialist logic. There is a convergence between the geographical scopes of the empires, especially the British one, and universalizing cultural discourses. Power makes this convergence possible to codify and disseminate knowledge, and above all, to rule them. In other words, the impulse to make the Bible into a universalizing cultural discourse and lord one interpretation over all others is actually a legacy of imperialism and colonialism. And so when interpreters ignore the differences within Scripture on slavery and enslavement, freedom and liberation, and instead they argue the Bible is universally pro-slavery or universally pro-liberation, they read the Bible with imperialistic logic or with imperialistic eyes. In other words, they read the Bible like a colonial oppressor. It's too simplistic to say the Bible condones or endorses slavery. And it's too simplistic to say the Bible is pro-liberation. Biblical texts and their interpretation are far more complicated than that. But that's not a good soundbite. And yet, that's the way it is. And so instead of trying to argue the Bible has a universal position on slavery or enslavement or freedom and liberation, I think it's a lot more helpful to decolonize the ways that we read biblical texts. In the humanities, this kind of interpretation is called postcolonial criticism. Decolonizing how we read is crucial because it helps us resist the impulse to argue that the Bible's on one side of an issue. Dr. Sugatharaja argues that postcolonialism sees the Bible as both problem and solution, and its message of liberation is seen as far more indeterminate and complicated. Postcolonial reading advocates the emancipation of the Bible from its implication in dominant ideologies, both at the level of text and at the level of interpretation. Now, I must confess, I'm not a Hebrew Bible scholar, I'm a New Testament scholar, and so I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of how to read the Hebrew Bible from a postcolonial lens. I'm sure there's way more qualified people who can talk about that. But when it comes to the New Testament, I think postcolonialism is very important. Dr. Judith Deal writes, scholars have recognized an unmistakable postcolonial factor in the New Testament literature. And that postcolonial factor changes how we should read the New Testament and its discussion on slavery and enslavement, freedom and liberation. Many texts in the New Testament are resistance literature. They're contesting imperial powers. And so when we read these texts like they're on the side of oppression and on the side of imperial values, we are dramatically misreading these texts. That being said, don't hear me making this video and think I have some kind of apologetical end. I'm not trying to defend texts of terror and oppression. It's true that there are texts within the Bible that can be used to legitimize and justify slavery. All I'm trying to say is that there are better ways to read some of these texts. Now, we don't have time to delve into every text that mentions this in the New Testament, but I do think we should talk about a text like Colossians 3 and the household codes because it's a really challenging text to understand.
Paul says slaves to obey your masters.
Yes.
Do you agree with Paul on that?
Wives submit to their husbands, and this is all in the context
Okay,
of children
so
submitting to their fathers.
People often take issue with Colossians 3:22 where it says, slaves obey your earthly masters. And to be honest here, to a person with power and privilege, this looks and sounds like someone condoning or endorsing slavery.
This is a social institution that Paul accepts.
And so Dr. McClellan is correct that Colossians 3 is drawing on a social institution, and that institution is the Greco-Roman household codes. One great example of these household codes is in Aristotle's Politics. Taken at face value, Aristotle and Colossians split up society into a strict hierarchy that justifies slavery and patriarchy. These household codes divided society into a strict hierarchy, with free men at the top of society and women, children, and the enslaved all at the bottom of society. This system is one of patriarchy and power adopted by the Roman Empire, and that settles it.
So while Paul himself may never explicitly endorse it, he unilaterally condones it.
However, there's a problem with this kind of reading. It ignores the broader literary context and the broader historical context. You see, in Colossians 2:8 it says, "See to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the principles of the world, and not according to Christ." You know, this statement would include philosophies like Aristotle's household codes. And then just before the household codes in Colossians 3:11, it has this radically equalizing statement. "There is no longer Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, free, but Christ is all and in all." You know, this doesn't really sound like condoning and endorsing slavery. You see, there is cognitive dissonance within Colossians if you accept the household codes in Colossians 3 as just adopting wholesale the patriarchal household codes from Aristotle and others. This is why postcolonial criticism is so important for understanding a text like Colossians. You see, we shouldn't read the New Testament like the authors could write down whatever they wanted. Historical study of the New Testament reveals that these texts were written by marginalized and oppressed Jews. And postcolonial criticism helps us understand how that oppression affected their writing and how we should interpret it. Postcolonial theorist Dr. Homi Bhabha points out in his book, The Location of Culture, that a marginalized person's discourse is stifled by their oppressive circumstances. When they resist power, their discourse is discourse at the crossroads of what is known and permissible, and that which, though known, must be kept concealed. A discourse uttered between the lines, and as such, both against the rules and within them. And similarly, the feminist theorist Dr. Elaine Showalter writes, "Muted groups must mediate their beliefs through the allowable forms of dominant structures. Another way of putting this would be to say that all language is the language of the dominant order, and women, if they speak at all, must speak through it." And so postcolonial reading of something like Colossians 3 would not argue that the text is legitimizing and justifying the imperial household codes, but rather the author of Colossians is resisting the dominant order but still speaking through it. The author writes both against the rules and within them. You see, Aristotle's Politics explains the household codes in a similar manner to Colossians, but Colossians is different in important ways. Notice how Aristotle orders the household codes. He begins master and slave, husband and wife, father and children. The male authority is always addressed first. Yet in Colossians, the standard order is subverted. The enslaved are mentioned before the masters. The wives are mentioned before the husbands. The children are mentioned before the fathers. You see, Colossians has subverted the household codes. It's resisting the dominant order, but still speaking through it. It's a discourse that is both writing against the rules and within them. This is one of the reasons why, in Dr. Sylvia Keys-Matt's notes on Colossians, in the Westminster Study Bible, she writes, "Paul has very carefully structured the commands to the masters and those who are enslaved so that they undermine slavery." Paul here is relativizing the authority of human masters. And so when we read Colossians like it's written by someone with power and authority, or when we read Colossians with an imperialistic or colonialist lens, yeah, it reads like the author of Colossians is an oppressor. For far too long, texts like Colossians have been leveled against women and leveled against enslaved people to assert that God's divine order is to have men rule over people and rule over households. This kind of reading ignores the complexities of these texts, and it just reads these texts with imperialistic eyes. But if we're going to be mature and critical readers of Scripture, it's time to move past this kind of reading. Reading Colossians informed by postcolonialism reveals that there's more to the text. It reveals that the language of Colossians is subverting and restricting the imperial power in ways that undermine that power. An oppressed Bible oppresses, and a liberated Bible liberates. And so when you read the Bible, will you be oppressing or will you be liberating? If you want to learn more about ancient slavery and its New Testament context, definitely check this book out. It's an edited volume. Each chapter is by different scholars, and you get a whole bunch of perspectives. It's excellent. So definitely go check this book out. Links are in the video description below. If you're looking for a new study Bible, the Westminster Study Bible is a new edition from Westminster John Knox, and it's full of great notes from many, many different scholars. Check out the link in the video description below. And just to be clear, I like a lot of what Dr. Dan McClellan puts out on the internet. I think he's a great public scholar, and we probably agree actually on a whole bunch of things. So definitely go check out his stuff. I put it down in the video description as well. And finally, early in 2026, my book is coming out in the Library of New Testament Studies. And so if you want to read more about how I think and understand hermeneutic theory, postcolonial theory, and more, feel free to go check out that book when it hits the shelves. It's called The Politics of Peace in Romans. Thanks for watching. Feel free to like and subscribe. Until next time, peace.